Kia ora, everyone. I guess I'll take the lead here, and I'll just introduce or start this little thing. I think we'll probably just go around to start with just by introducing ourselves. Kia ora and g'day. My name's Naftali Faulkner. I created Umurangi Generation, and I'm a Ngaitarangi man living in Australia. So I'm sort of off country at the moment. But yeah, I'm really excited to have this chat today where we're just sort of going to talk about, apparently Rob said we can talk about whatever we want. So we'll have to be talking about something good then. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
I guess I could jump in. Thanks so much, Rob and GGP for having this together, putting this together. I am, aloha, Chris Okoui Noa no Kalihi. I'm Chris. I'm a native Hawaiian activist and indie game developer here in Hawaii. And yeah, I'm glad to be. I believe this is like the third Indigenous game dev panel on this channel I would have been on, and along with Miranda and Tali. So yeah, always happy to be with our relatives again to get into whatever it is we're going to be getting into, and I'll cut it short.
Well, I can go next. Tande, Megan Byrne Nasikason, Nea Apatawako Sisan, Hamilton, Ontario, Ochin. Hi, my name is Megan Byrne. I'm Apatawako Sisan. Federally, we are recognized as part of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And I'm a game designer, and I'm also the founder of Achmastawastan Games, which is a small indie game studio out of Ontario, Canada.
Okay, I'm not muted anymore. So I'll go now. Noah, my name is Miranda. I am a member of the Pawnee Nation, and I'm also Cherokee. And I am a video game producer. I work for Treyarch, working on Call of Duty. I'm really excited to be here. I do a lot of speaking engagements on Indigenous representation and Indigenous games, and I'm really happy to call all of you my colleagues and friends. And I'm really excited to hear what everyone's up to and what we want to talk about today.
We have
Karen, go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm late. I would joke about running on Indian time, but I think that's kind of old to be saying. I was having computer issues, so modern Indian time. I am Southern Cheyenne, born and grew up in Oklahoma, and live up in Canada now. I've lived here 15 years, and I work at a studio called BioWare. We make big story-based RPGs, and I'm an editor and writer, so I try and make the words go on all these big old games. I really appreciate the opportunity to be included here. Thanks so much.
Well, yeah, so we've got free reign to talk about whatever we like. And I think we've got a really good selection of people here on today. A lot of people who sort of work as sort of indie developers like me and Chris, as well as Megan. And then we've also got, people who sort of work in that AAA space. So I think it's a pretty good mix of people here. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. But I think something that would be really good to start talking about to begin with is this idea of telling your own story. I think there's a really big strength to that when it comes to having sort of sort of diversity in a space like this, because it's the kind of thing where your story gets that much richer the more you sort of have different voices coming in and being able to tell something correctly, but also tell it in a way where I think is done respectfully to the history and culture that is being talked about. So the thing I kind of think about with that is with Umurangi Generation, one of the things about that story was about obscuring the how would you put it? Obscuring the iwi and sort of making it so that the people in the story weren't identified as a specific family, and making it so that whilst you could kind of tell and piece it together if you're from that area, it was about sort of taking that and just putting it to the side, because it's kind of this thing where when it comes to, I think, the history of places like that and the ongoing effects of colonization, it's really this sort of thing where you can do a lot of damage by stepping your foot in a place where it shouldn't go. And so the thing I kind of think about that is sort of like when we've seen sort of Indigenous stories told on large scales in games and stuff like that, I think consultation's a really important thing to have, because basically if you are going to be making a game about a very specific place and a very specific story, you need to go and talk with people, because not everything is something that you can get out of a book to understand what's actually going on there. And I think it's just really a thing of respect. You wouldn't like someone making a story about your family and not asking you, specific details. And if it's the kind of thing where, we see kind of the ongoing effects of colonization with sort of stereotypes and things like that, I think it's a really dangerous thing to start to go into. And I think that's why I kind of think that whole idea of telling your own story is really important. So that means bringing people from that space in, in filmmaking, it would be behind the camera, but I think it's that idea of saying, bringing people in who can sort of tell that story and knowing the right way to sort of walk through, the ideas and themes you want to talk about in it. Because I think it's a really important thing to have that, just because when we're talking about, this idea of like decolonization and things like that, I think that's one of the first steps is giving sovereignty of people's, stories back. So yeah, I think that's something I kind of think about, and who knows where this yarn will go, but that's what I think we could probably start with talking about, because I know we all probably have a bit of experience with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great topic. That's something I have been talking a lot about when I, talk to classes or at work and stuff. And it's just comes down to like, is this your story to tell? I think that really good storytelling comes from authenticity, and that really lets players connect to what you're telling. That lets them connect to like whatever they're playing through, and I think that gets you more engagement. You'll have players that want to play more, you'll make more money, and at the end of the day, that's what a lot of at least in my sphere is. I'm at the end of the day, we're trying to make money. So when I'm pushing, to hire diversity, to hire authentic voices, what I'm really saying is like, you want the best story to be told so that people are coming to your game to play that, and not just, getting a little piece of representation or just getting that little nugget that's not quite satisfying. So I think that's something that we still don't really see very often in the AAA sphere. And I really, I'm hoping in the next 5 years we start to see that. I mean, we've been seeing it in television with Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls, like that true authentic story being told by the people that have lived that. And it's really wonderful to see how audiences react to that. So I think, we're coming to changes happening, but in the AAA space, I feel like it's just been really slow. But I think it'd be cool to hear about some of the more indie viewpoint on that.
I just want to jump in because I love Reservation Dogs and I want everyone to go watch it. But no, not just because of that, but also because it is like my favorite show of the last year and probably the last decade. I'm watching a lot of Peacemaker and Boba Fett, to be honest, which Boba Fett also includes Indigenous. Temuera Morrison is also, he has a lot of input, including the weapon and the culture that went into that Star Wars property. Just as another example, which is I was really happy to see that in influencing such a huge IP as Star Wars. Just as a concrete example of like how you can not simply have, as Miranda was saying, people that are different color, different shades, but still kind of living out a colonizer, or just not a colonizer, just not living out their authentic realities and stories. Whereas Reservation Dogs, which had Taika Waititi, Indigenous, Maori person, Scarlett Harjo, and it's like authentically told. I'm a native Hawaiian, and like I felt it when they're eating the Flamin' Flamers. I'm like, that's like all the kids in my. I used to teach in like at risk, underserved, like kids with underserved youth of the inner city. Let's say basically it's the ghetto, but they were all eating hot Cheetos all day, and they're not even at a reservation. And I'm just like, it just felt so authentic. Like, this is my life as even an Indigenous Hawaiian, thousands of miles away in the Pacific. And I could tell that there was like authentic input. It wasn't simply people who are Indigenous living out, or people who are Indigenous acting out a white story, to be more frank about it, which is like a counterexample. There were some other shows that I don't want to actually cause too many problems with that, but I do think that those are the positive examples. So if we have kind of more of that, and more of that in games, it would be really great. And I think it is, people want to see more of that. Peacemaker has somebody eating a lot of hot Cheetos, and somebody was listening somewhere. I don't want to say exactly what. I don't have the receipts on that, but I also like that show a lot. And I feel like, are the producers on the project listening to input from a diversity of voices, Indigenous and different genders, different orientations is really important, and you can feel it. I feel like I can feel it when I'm watching these shows. And just on the indie, and then I'll hand it off. On the indie game front, of course, like I'm a Silver Spoon Games is just basically, it's a bit mostly me right now, and I'm working with a handful of other folks, but I do Neophyte, of course. I talked about last year. It's Indigenous. It's like my experiences as a native Hawaiian, living in under U.S. occupation and under very terrible racialized capitalist conditions, and just kind of being homeless for periods of time, et cetera. And it's just kind of like it's like a cyberpunk dystopia that is kind of living economic and racially discriminatory reality, and working with children who are trying to survive that. And so that story is a very personal story that's like very particular to me. And I said exactly what I wanted to say, because it's a small indie game project that I'm not attached to any other funders or big producers. So it's basically exactly what I wanted to do. That's a thing that's, that's not a thing that everybody can do, but if you are, a smaller studio, it's a thing that you can do, especially in the indie space where you have a little bit more freedom to experiment with different stories. I mean, it's a point and click adventure. It's kind of like Disco Elysium with cyberpunk characteristics. It's kind of its own weird, it's visual novelty and it's puzzly. And so that gives you a little bit of freedom in a way that a bigger studio wouldn't. I think we need all of that. Because it's not going to be as visible as like a bigger Treyarch game. And so in those bigger spaces, we do need people that are like, it's not going to be as big as the Star Wars or a Peacemaker. So we need people that are also working in those like bigger franchises, bigger entertainment products, whether those are interactive or otherwise. I'll hand it off now to whoever wants to jump in. I call on Megan.
I was gonna say Megan doesn't look like she's muted. So
yeah, can you hear me fine? All right, good. I'm doing everything off my phone because I actually just recently moved, and I don't have any internet at my home until probably next month, maybe. I think for me, the biggest thing that I've been kind of working through as well, I'm doing my first game, and I'm kind of doing my first game with a team, which actually is like now majority Indigenous as well. And it's a different scene than trying to just do something on my own. Because like I run the studio, and I think something that I didn't really realize when I started doing this project was, I want to work with other Indigenous people and do stuff. I started realizing when I took on a business, I'm now responsible for other people. And that's a level of responsibility I haven't really had experience with. And kind of growing up in, North America, hyper-capitalist, very like, just use and lose people. People are disposable, people are replaceable. And I was like, that's not true. That is not true when you are starting out. And it is especially not true in a game, like I think in any video game. You don't just lose knowledge when somebody leaves a project. You lose a chunk of that project because they are putting part of themselves into that. And when I may be kind of the face of the company, but this isn't all me. And even if I'm like doing all the writing, like for me, Scarajona is our lead artist and artistic lead. He puts a lot in, and he's Mohawk and Mexican Indigenous. And so he's coming from a different place than I am, from like my Cree Métis side, but we're both kind of under the same family of Anishinaabe. So we do have a lot of things in common in terms of like how our cultures do things. And we kind of find that place in the middle. And I think it was kind of neat, the fact that we're doing this like cyber noir future piece where we were like, hey, what could it be like, with everything we have right now going forward? Let's put it 200 years in the future. What's it like? So it's a bit of a mishmash, right? But that's kind of what we're living with. So it works. But if he had to leave, if he had to leave for like whatever, like I ran out of money, or he got offered a better job or something like that, that's a piece of the soul of my project gone. That what he left behind we can have and we can use, but like that's, we don't know what else we could have had. And it's kind of things that I didn't think about because I wasn't prepped in a culture where that was something you had to think about. So it's been kind of a hard learning. My partner, he's been great. He's like, just think of it like a master's thesis. Like you're gonna cry a lot, you're gonna learn a lot, but yeah, these things have been important to me to learn. I think for me, thinking about how I want to make things and how I want to be a leader has really made me think really hard about what are the things that I want to do in a business. And also, I'm kind of in a space where we're kind of actively encouraged to use people. Oh, it's fine. Like, they need to make rent, but you need to keep your budget under, or you need to keep your budget on time, and you're like, I really want to make sure they make rent. Yeah, and that's definitely, that's been rough, being able to find those spaces and also make something that people enjoy. So I think for me, it's been more about the experience of making than it's been the finishing. And well, we'll see. It's my first major project, and it's not going to be out until like Q4. So we'll see how that goes.
I believe in you, Megan.
I appreciate
That's really
that.
cool. It sounds really great. I would, yeah, like coming from the AAA space, I kind of ditto a lot of what Miranda said. Things move slowly. It's huge teams of people. I'm part of it. BioWare is part of EA. And so we've got, global teams of people all over the world. And it's interesting because in this space I'm in, it's all sci-fi fantasy. So it's not real, we're not looking at real backgrounds of anyone. And so it's always a challenge to figure out how to get good representation and what good representation looks like of genders, of racial backgrounds, of sexual orientations, all of that. And how do we sort of cram all of that into a made up IP that in a way that feels real and feels representative. And the team that I'm on, they write the stories. And so we do a lot of talking about that. And one of the, an interesting conversation that's kind of ongoing is, you want to be inclusive and representative, even if you're not from a culture you're trying to represent. It's a big studio. It's still a lot of straight white guys that are in it, making it, making the games. And a lot of the people I work with do want to be inclusive, but they might not have the knowledge. It's like, yes, it's important. Okay, let's make sure we have racial equivalency and, you know, different skin tones and stuff in all of the characters that we have, major characters, background characters. And it's, you know, how do you do that respectfully? How do you just, you know, because like, you know, have been brought up, it's not sort of just putting a facial shader on someone, you know, that's a color, but then how do you represent where that person comes from? And so it's the idea of sort of the split between how to be inclusive of everyone, regardless of who's coming from what culture, and then what stories are yours to tell. And so, you know, I think we try to make progress on being inclusive, but we're also very aware that only certain people can tell their own stories. And if we're not those certain people, you know, anyone who's not in that group probably shouldn't be doing that and should be making space for those folks to tell their own stories. So it's, you know, a lot of conversation, a lot of figuring out how to do that well. And it's happening more. You know, I've worked there almost 16 years now, and there are a lot more conversations about it than there used to be. So that's, you know, it's kind of like moving one of those big old barges in the middle of the ocean. You're trying to get into, but it's starting to go a little bit. So more to do, but it's good to see it starting to happen, at least from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I got a question last week from someone, and it was about like, you know, how can you like have representation in games that provide customization to players, and how can that, you know, how can you maintain that without like people being offensive and stuff like that. And so I think it's definitely a topic that I know people, you know, we talk about all the time, but for me as a player, like just being able to make my character have brown skin is, you know, awesome. Like growing up playing The Sims, being able to have like a brown family, or for me, you know, I'm adopted, so I had a white and brown family, which is really awesome to be able to have, just be able to make my own story in that type of game. Even when I'm playing Call of Duty, like I always get really excited when I see players with like their tribal name, or, you know, something like that, because I always recognize that, like, yeah, Lakota girls online, that's awesome. So I think just even those little places where people can express their identity in a place where they aren't necessarily like taking in a story that is representative of them is super important, and really, you know, helps players feel connected.
It makes me smile because the first time, I'm obviously of mixed race background. My dad's Cheyenne, and I think the first time he and my mom kind of got what it was we were doing, because we moved up here with my partner, and so we took a copy of Mass Effect 1 down, and my dad made himself in the game and made himself with dark skin, and he was having so much fun trucking around with someone who looks like him, and he was like, okay, I get, you know, I kind of get what you're doing, I get, you know what. And that was really neat to see, you know, just watching his eyes light up and go, oh, look, there's something like me. So there's someone like me. It is me. So yeah, that's fun when that happens.
Something I've sort of been thinking about around all this stuff is kind of like this idea, like we have, you know, these awesome character creators and stuff now. But one thing I've sort of been thinking about a lot, and this is sort of what I want to do into the future, you know, Umurangi is a really good starting point, but, you know, it was also made in 8 months, so it's not, you don't have that time to really get into that really deep, I think, thinking state, if that makes sense, where like, you know, where you will have those moments where you sit and you talk about certain things, and as the conversation goes around, it gets richer and richer to where you're starting to talk about a really, I guess, ancestral philosophy around a lot of this stuff. So for me, it's always this idea of how do you embed Indigenous knowledge into the design philosophies of the game you're building from the ground up. And so for me, you know, I think that that's probably the most important thing to start with when making games. If you're really trying to, you know, get this stuff embedded into it, because I think it's this kind of thing where what I sort of think about is kind of this idea that like, I'm thinking about like, you know, Taika Waititi, obviously one of the, you know, greatest Indigenous directors in sort of contemporary times and stuff like that, you know, makes a movie about Thor, but it's a movie from the ground up. It's an Indigenous story about, invasion and all this stuff, right? And so people go in and they consume it, and then they consume it as a really awesome Thor movie. And then there's all this other stuff that they can start to look at and take apart and start to really understand this thing, right? You mentioned that Boba Fett show. I finished watching that with my little cousin, and it's really obvious in the scenes. Uncle Tem there is teaching the guy how to use the taiaha. You know what I mean? It's not, he's supposed to get trained by the guy, but you can see the guy who's training him is sort of like that, and he's very smooth with it. I think it's the sort of thing I kind of think about is that, like, there are certain concepts that don't translate to English, and there are certain concepts that don't fit that sort of, I guess, Western worldview. And so I think what I want to start to do even more in this space, and who knows where my journey will take me. Maybe I'll go to AAA at some point and direct something there. But the idea I have is that from the foundation upwards, it's got a philosophy, I think, that is basically invisible to people who can't see that sort of stuff that happens. And so, like, I've got a couple ideas that I'm not going to share here, but because I know AAA always stealing indie ideas. No, there's things I think which could definitely, would have that sort of wider appeal, I guess, with sort of it being this thing that is Indigenous from the ground up, but anyone can come into it, because the reality of our cultures is they aren't isolationist in that sense. Obviously there is stuff that needs to be protected, and we don't want certain ways overriding ours or being colonized and stuff, but they're, I bet from everyone here there is probably stories of people being welcomed in, and I think that that's a very unifying thing amongst a lot of cultures around the earth. Yeah, sorry, that's just what I was thinking about. Passing it on.
Maybe I can jump in. I just thinking about like other possible games, because I talked a little about, the first flagship Silver Spoon game, Neofeud, is definitely like a game that's kind of about surviving. Like we say, a lot of people watching like Don't Look Up and a lot of these dystopian science fiction movies coming out on Netflix nowadays with Leo DiCaprio, etc. They're about an apocalypse coming, climate change, war, something, economic, COVID, delta epsilon, that's like 90% kill rate. But the apocalypse for Indigenous people was 500 years ago, right? It was like the end of the world was colonization. So Neofeud is kind of a game about surviving the apocalypse that's already happened. For me, just like having to like working full time and like, living in a Mazda tribute, eating spoonfuls of peanut butter for dinner, trying to teach kids, walking to work because I had no, car to drive in. And, it just, it's an experience that it's universal, because even if you aren't Indigenous, you could still suffer just like incredible inequality in, a place like the United States. But it has a particular meaning for people whose language was banned, culture was banned, like us Native Hawaiians, and still remain kind of subjugated in our own land, and our culture commodified, etc. So that's Neofeud is about surviving a dystopia. It's like cyberpunk dystopia is just being Indigenous, and that's kind of part of the point. It's like and it's not as always as fun, and it's not as like bouncing off the side of buildings and getting shot with retractable brain jacking Motoko Kusanagi's, doing cool stuff with Keanu Reeves in your brain in a neural implant. It's not always that fun. Sometimes it's just mundane and sad, and that's part of the realism of Neofeud. But it's also very comedic. And so Neofeud 2, though, I was like, I don't want to just survive the apocalypse. I want a world that is decolonized and that is resuming kind of like I call it. I'm thinking of it more as kind of like a normal healed human civilization network, across the planet of, as people, as kind of Naftali was alluding to, where they accept that there are different cultures, right? And they don't seek to either crush, control, or commodify those cultures. They're just different, and you can visit, and you might even, for in Hawaii, we call it hanai, is when you become adopted into a family. And that was a regular thing. And skin color was not actually the limiting factor for what made you. There was no blood quantum. What made you Hawaiian was not actually like literally where your blood came from. That's a very Western concept, a colonizer concept. And so, and so people moving and exchanging culture, people learning from other cultures, but respecting, that's a very important one in Boba Fett too. It's like that was the very important Indigenous. Boba Fett is really like a cyberpunk kids with their speeders and their robot arms, right? Suffering with the water lord, like Immortan Joe is like, and then Boba Fett respects them where no one else does. And he says, I'll respect you. I'll give you the water at a reasonable price. Work with me. Right. And then he meets the Wookiee and it's like, you're being treated as a plaything by the rich, and used as a kind of gladiatorial entertainment. I'll respect you and you join me. Right. And it's like, it's building this kind of like Silk Road of sorts of this network of different people that are working together. And so anyways, and so I'm thinking of like Neophyte 2 is definitely, I'm thinking about like, there is still broken parts of the world, right? In a cyberpunk dystopian science fictional world. It's in the future. It's more closer to Star Wars, actually. It's like space, but it still has dystopian broken parts of it. But then there's also like web networks of people that are exchanging and not destroying, right? Just being different and coexisting, but economically and socially equal. And now they're struggling against this other empire of sorts. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about for in terms of like designing worlds. And for me, it's like I'm not gonna have any Asian characters in my cyberpunk world because a lot of times I'm actually Asian and Pacific Islander. It's very one appropriation is just like throwing random Chinese characters up that means like lucky chicken on a Korean store. Or it's just really kind of like that's a thing in cyberpunk. I'm like I've always kind of been like, let's not do that. But I want it to be, I want to borrow from my Asian and Pacific heritage and try to like infuse a future that's it's not Earth, so it's not gonna literally be any culture. And that is a tricky thing that was alluded to earlier by Karen, I believe. It's like, how do you have like a science fictional world that's not Earth, that is not taking, because everything has always been coded in a certain sense. So that's been something I'm working on, but it's something that I feel like and as an indie studio, I'm like basically one person, maybe me and a couple of people. I'm basically, I wish I wasn't taking as long as I did, but I'm basically writing. I'm trying to nail down this whole huge story, and I have a little more leeway because of being an indie studio. But it is always something I have to think about. I'm like, should I use this word? Can I use this word? I mean, how do I make this word a science fiction word without it like, is it too close to this Maori word or this Chinese word or this Hawaiian word? And that's something that I don't know. I don't think there's really a solid answer for that, but I mean, just approaching it like Boba Fett with respect and not in a stealing approach is, I think, a first step. And yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And well, that really resonates for me because another part of, working somewhere so big is we have, I'm part of an Indigenous employees group that's all over the world. And so there's so many, occasionally look at like, well, what would be respectful to the Indigenous community? And it's like in North America alone, there are thousands of different tribes with different cultures and different languages, so there's not going to be, on one hand, there's not going to be a unified approach, but exactly like you were saying, there's a lot of cousins all over the world, and a lot of similarities, and the details might not be exactly the same, but that feeling and those experiences, and especially everyone who's been colonized and had their religion outlawed and their languages banned and sent to boarding schools or residential schools, that's something that's going to ring true for all of those people. And so, yeah, it's a challenge, I think, really tricky to figure out, okay, great, how do we actually do that? But you're absolutely right. It has to come from the people themselves. And, even though I've worked in AAA my whole career, I get the indie games really excite me because that's a chance for those voices that haven't traditionally been heard in the game space to really be strong and come out and spark ideas and inspire other people, and other people play your game and are like, that's cool, I want to do that too, and then maybe you're working together. And so it's really exciting to hear about what you're doing. That's incredibly cool.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Anybody who wants to make games, I encourage. If just one person decides to make some authentic games about their own stories because they played one of mine, that makes it all worth it.
We got a question. Aloha, my kako. Most sincere and warmest greetings to you all. has your experience in the gaming industry, the trajectory of your influenced the trajectory of your personal life and its relation to your political ideology? Mahalo for your wisdom, time, and sharing with us. Peace, love, and aloha. I hope I got that Hawaiian right. Spook, you can rate that out of 10. It's very
10 out of 10.
Little similar to Maori, but yeah.
Very close. There's a few L's where there would be R's. It's very close, but yeah.
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 So if we wanted to go around and talk about that question, sorry for sort of cutting the discussion there, but we did say we'd answer questions, I guess. So I'll let someone else answer that first.
I'll say something before someone else jump in really quick. But yeah, the Pod Synergy is a friend of ours and is actually like here at the Silver Spook compound. Yeah, let's put it that way. So thanks for the question. And yeah, someone else take it because I've been talking a lot.
I'll take it first. I think that's a really interesting question because I've never really thought about how my experience in the game industries influenced my life. I usually think of it like the opposite way, but I don't know. I guess like working in AAA games, I don't know, it's made me like a lot more cynical on a lot of things. I think I feel like existing at a AAA studio as an Indigenous person is hard. It's like really hard for me to have to defend my space there, to have to advocate for people like me. I'm working on starting an Indigenous network and it's really fucking hard and exhausting. And I feel like there's so much extra work I will volunteer and take on because I care about, how the space can impact Indigenous people and how welcoming it can be towards future Indigenous people. So I feel like there's a lot of challenges that come with that. And so I'd say like being in that space, it's made me like definitely want to fight harder for, worker rights, fight harder for, just access for Indigenous people to be in this space. We still don't have, everyone still doesn't have water in North America, like we don't have the internet. Like having internet on reservations is a big deal. It'd be able to help kids make games at home. They'd be able to take remote coursework. They'd be able to work remotely. And like, so, it kind of pushes me to be more active and involved in policy. And, I'm trying to, get more involved in my local politics just to make sure that I can make sure that there's future Indigenous game developers, and that starts with making sure that they have the education, they have the access to whatever they need. So I guess that I'm just so lonely at Activision that I'm just doing whatever I can to make sure that the future is not the way it is now.
Something I kind of always think about is, games get to stop being political when war criminals aren't on the board of directors, something I kind of think has really changed my political ideology in the short time I've sort of been in the game space is when you start to see these stories come out where you have, former politicians who, authorized countless war crimes in the Iraq War heading these companies. You go, how is that allowed to happen? And then when you hear about things like CEOs funneling money into politics for like Republican campaigns and stuff like that, I just think it's this kind of thing where, I want to make works that sort of have a political edge to them because I think it's this sort of thing where if you don't really push back in that space, it'll just sort of keep growing like that. And, I'm probably not alone with a lot of people sort of being in that thing where it was honestly shocking seeing what came out when those shakeups did happen at those companies. And so, yeah, I think it's this sort of thing where I've tried to take less of a passive stance and take more of a, I guess, active. I'm just thinking about for this next project I'm working on, taking more of an active pushing back against a lot of this stuff. So yeah, I'd say that's how that's affected me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you bring up like a really good point there. I think one thing that there's been a lot of times like over the past 6 months that I've just wanted to quit and leave AAA games, and I get disgusted by, you know, the things I hear. I get completely heartbroken by the stories I've heard from my peers, and I guess, you know, there's one thing, like I just, you know, I want to be a change. I want to work my way up in these systems that historically have not been welcoming to people like me. So it's hard, but you know, I hope someday I'm able to be, you know, a studio head and to be able to make that change. And I hope that other Indigenous people feel welcome in these spaces. And it's really upsetting, like how terrible things have been in the industry. And you know, at my workplace, it's been challenging to just kind of deal with that. So, you know, I'm hopeful, cautiously hopeful, but it is really hard. And I'm just grateful that, you know, there's really awesome devs outside of these AAA spaces that are, you know, supporting those of us that are in here and are, you know, doing some amazing work and stuff. So yeah, thanks for always being there.
You know, you always have the Indigenous game devs group, you know, Rhonda is.
Well, and it is hard, I think, in a AAA space because, you know, it's and it's particularly hard when you're, you know, intersectional. You know, I'm a woman, I'm queer, I'm Indigenous, and you know, I always joke that I'm a threefer. You know, and they have conversations about, hey, how do we, you do, but it does get really exhausting because you have to advocate for yourself, and not, you know, even if it's not a terrible story, like a lot of the terrible stories we've been hearing, there's just this sort of wall of how it's been, and you have to do so much educating and point of view on top of the job that you're trying to do, that it, you know, I absolutely get why people leave, you know, and so you kind of have to choose, well, can I, you know, do I have to take care of myself and remove myself from this space, or can I advocate to change it from within? Because it does feel like that's how it needs to happen. And, you know, I've been lucky enough, BioWare has been pretty progressive in terms of gender representation and queer relationships and things like that. So I have had a positive experience seeing the difference that can make, you know, that when you're successful and you, you know, you succeed in putting characters in that haven't been represented before. And I've been really privileged to, you know, go to cons and talk with people and get to really hear one-on-one how much difference it makes. So, you know, I think it's a worthwhile fight, but it is hard and it's challenging, and it's really nice to have support for a lot of people because it's changing, but it does feel awfully slow sometimes.
Yeah, like, sorry, I've just been quiet because I've been thinking, because I kind of came up through the art space first. And I think the most radical thing that's happened to me is this realization that it's not a radical act to hurt yourself or others. It's actually a radical act to love yourself and to say no to things and stop. So one thing to understand about the art space, and this is very specific to, I think, to Canada, is that we do have these supports. We have these great federally and provincially funded things, and they've done and still continue to do a lot of work to sort of break their biases and whatnot, but it still heavily privileges a very upper, to, if you're lucky, still part of that middle class group, university educated, specifically if you've like gone and done an English degree, because that's, you kind of need to know how to do an English degree in order to write some of these grants. And this space, I have seen this destroy amazing Indigenous artists, people who started off so incredibly generous, so incredibly loving, and it just whittled at them until there wasn't really much left. That they like nothing left for anyone else, I guess is a better way of putting it. So, and it's because we're told to give and give and give, and you know what, that embitters you. That doesn't make you a better person to give without making sure that you're also taking care of yourself. And so I started realizing that it's kind of a radical act for me to say, nope, I'm not going to run this event, or nope, I'm not going to help right now because I have just been giving and there hasn't been any getting. And you know, when you start talking about that and other people start realizing, they're like, whoa, you're right. Like, I was doing some really cool stuff and I really loved doing it, but you know what? I wasn't getting anything in return. And I don't mean sort of like this, financial back and forth, where we're commodifying things. I mean, like, I was giving my all and being asked, oh, is that all you got? Can you not give more? And I was like, I have flayed myself for this space. How about maybe somebody else, pick up a bit of, if I'm slacking, that's not me being lazy. That's not like me not doing my best. That's I need more support. And then the idea, especially in nonprofit areas, to ask for more support, it's like you slap them sometimes. Like, how dare you? Don't you do it for the love? Don't you want to just give everything of yourself? And I was like, that is very capitalist. It's incredibly colonial. I mean, when we start looking at the history of like, how did colonial powers really get a foothold in this country? They dumped bodies here. They were like, yeah, come over to this land. There's farmland. You can have. They took people who didn't know what they were doing, had no skills, no resources, and they literally used them as meat shields. And we continue this today in like so many facets of every part of our society. And it's like the radical thing you can do is help somebody, and not the kind of like, oh, I gave you a hand up. I was like, no, like, meet your neighbor, get to know their name, check out, make sure they've got hot water, make sure they've got, like, is their heating working in the winter? Like, these are radical acts that literally the powers to be don't want, because then people spend less. If you have a community and you're sharing a snowblower, because it gets really bad up here in winter, but if you had like a neighborhood or even a street that shared a snowblower, well, that's a loss of profit to somebody, because instead of having 10 households each with a snowblower, you have one household with a snowblower. That's like a loss of 9 snowblowers. Like, this is how so many of these businesses think. They don't want you to help one another because you spend more when you don't help one another. And this is kind of what's radicalized me of being in the art space and working in games, is we have to start engaging in radical acts of self and community love. And it's hard. Like, how many people today don't actually know how to just go talk to their neighbor, who feel uncomfortable, who are like, oh, I don't want to, it's awkward, it'll be cringe. I was like, why is it, why? Where's that feeling coming from? It's because you've been taught that that's a weird thing to do. And it's like, as an Indigenous person, I'm like, no, that's the weirdness, is the not knowing your neighbor. You're not caring about if your neighbor's okay. That's weird. And we need to start normalizing the idea of being like, hey, how are you doing? We live in the same apartment building. I noticed you were having some problem with your groceries. Do you want me to give you a hand next time? And if they say no, that's fine, because we're still not used to getting, things from others. We're used to giving.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think I remember someone on Twitter posted like, oh, like, why do people talk to their neighbors? And I was like, why wouldn't you talk to your neighbor? Like, I was gone for a couple of weeks, and my neighbor like didn't see me, and so I got back and they're like, oh, you're alive. We were worried about you. And I was like, yeah, thank you. I should have told you I was leaving. That's what I'll do next time. And then my other neighbor gave me an autobiography she wrote. So things here in Oklahoma are a bit different.
Bring them
I haven't
cookies.
read it yet. Yeah. I was gonna bake soon, but I need to read her book. I'll do that soon.
Just gonna jump in real quick on the just on the question, like on Phil, how is your game experiences impacted your life? I just wanted to say that the games that I make are they're fairly political, I would say, already, but it's definitely and just on the clean water thing. Like I remember when we had the panel with John, I was in a good way taken aback because John was like, "Oh, I heard that there's a lot of John Romero, the Doom creator, etc., co-founder of id Software, was like, oh my goodness, I heard that there was really a lot of struggles with water and Hawaiians like not getting access to their water." That was like before the Red Hill disaster that is ongoing, and I've been trying to get as involved in that as I can because if you don't know about that, it's pretty terrible. All of the water for the most populous island in Hawaii, Oahu, could be undrinkable. It's basically being poisoned by U.S. military, essentially their Indo-Pacific Command, and so that's been that's been really hard. Because my family, I'm actually from the area, the area that Neofood is actually about is about 2 miles, Kalihi, Palama specifically. It's right next to that area, and so that's been really rough. And I try to do that on I'm doing that direct, political. I'm trying to get involved with putting eyes on that and just sharing about that and doing whatever I can to support that continuous struggle, very difficult struggle, along with other struggles. But yeah, it's tough to, it is tough to kind of do all of them at the same time sometimes. So I'm trying to do some of that and then also finish the game because I've been working on the Neo52 for like 5 years. So I'm kind of like, I have to like kind of balance how much time I spend on Twitter because it can also like fray all of my creative energy if I do too much and I spend like 6 hours with Reply Guy 25 going, there's no such thing as colonialism, it's gone. And I'm like, no. So I just I don't interact with that. But anyways, anyway, yeah, that's my short comment on that. I see that we're very close to the end, so probably should start wrapping up.
So I guess maybe like a good last question is, what do you hope to see change in the industry in the next year? Since I assume we'll do this again next year.
I think the thing I really want to see is basically like I'm thinking of like something I've been thinking about for a while, and every time I had yarn with Miranda, I always think about this, or see your tweets, I think about this because you work at Activision. Is eventually there'll be a World War II game that will be about Indigenous soldiers, right? This is something I know will eventually happen, right? It might be Māori soldiers, it could be Native American soldiers, like Navajo code talkers or something like that. How's that going to look when it gets made, and what's going to be the story that's told, right? Because I think with those games, they always end up being these things where they're very like, to some extent, a little bit pro-war. And, if you know any of these stories about a lot of Indigenous soldiers, they were kind of duped into serving these wars with the promise of land back. And then when they got home, the land was given to the soldiers they were fighting next to who weren't Indigenous. So the thing I kind of always think about is when those stories are eventually going to be told in this space, what are they going to look like, and who is going to be helming them? Who is going to be basically nurturing this story that has been passed down and put into a space where people can sort of participate in the story or via second person, really, even though they're first person games, but via second person, hear those stories come from it. Like I kind of think about, there was a franchise of World War II shooters in the 2000s that was based directly on actual combat operations, and like the maps were actually like based on aerial photography of towns that group went through and stuff. And I think that's the kind of like representation I would like to see, is where like that stuff is either the story is listened to and it is told correctly. So I think that's something I'm sort of thinking about the industry. Where I want to go is starting to tackle some of these bigger topics that I don't think the game space is really ready for yet. But I think there's a good thing about doing that, because if you are kind of some of the first people in that conversation, you can shift it to the direction it needs to go, rather than, I think sometimes we see conversations or discourse that does enter into the game space gets entered into from this very casual centristy type position where it's there, but it's kind of been pushed to sit passively whilst it's still ongoing. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, where can we find you, Tali, by the way?
You can find me on Twitter, which is just Veselikov. And if you want to follow the game, you can just go to Umanagi Game on Twitter. Thank you.
You can find me at achimogames.ca or Achimo on Twitter, and I think it's Achimo_games on Instagram.
I'm just my name on Twitter, Karen Weeks, Weekes.
And I'm at Miranda Dew on Twitter. That's the best place to find me. Yeah.
And I'm at Silver Spook Games minus the E in silver, or at Silver Spook Guy is my more personal one. And the Neo Feud. I'm sorry if it's hard to spell. But yeah, that's you can look for those on Steam, Itch, etc. And that's where all my stuff is. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was really fun, like talking to everyone again. It's always nice to chat about these topics, and I too hope that we have some war games that really change the narrative. And I think I really want to see like a multi-generational revenge military game. So Call of Duty, come on.
That has a great ring to it.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I appreciate it.
Bye.
Aloha.
Hey, hey.